Welcome to Health Reform 2.0, the only place on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. Here we take you on a journey of our current quagmire, tell you where it came from and why the government can't fix it. Along the way, we'll tell you some history, bust a few big myths, tell you a few stories, and give you an idea how we can work together and get the healthcare system we want. Let's get started. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Healthcare Reform 2.0, the only podcast on the planet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. My name's Tom Loker. I'm joined today by my co-host Tim Henning, and we're doing episode 1.6, and we're going to be covering the area of 1930 up to just short of 1950, depending upon timing. And Tim today is up in the mountains of Lake Tahoe at his spread up there, his ranch. So, Tim, how are you, and what's happening?
Doing great, Tom. How are you today?
Pretty good. How's the back 40? Did you get up there and start cleaning up all the stuff you had to clean up?
No, because I couldn't figure out how to start the chainsaw, but I got that going this morning, as you know. So we got a lot of work to do in the back for sure. We had a drought up here, as you know, and the bark beetles took their toll. So we have to get those dead trees out of here. So it's therapeutic, that's for sure.
It's nothing's better than sitting out there. It used to make Ronald Reagan strong like bull.
Yeah. Clearing brush. I think George Bush tried that too, but I'm not buying that. We've been working hard, and the weather's going to change. It's going to start raining again, which we need. So it'll be a couple of days of rain, then it'll be sun. Beautiful. A couple of days ahead of time, though. So not complaining.
Well, what are we going to talk about today in episode 1.5? We covered quite a bit at the last episode and took us from the late 1800s up to about 1910, 1920, and we're going to kind of pick up some of that again and carry it forward because there's a lot of little pieces in there that kind of lay the groundwork going forward. But what are we really going to do today?
So this will be a bit more interesting in terms of probably people's historical perspective of a number of people on the Great Depression, what happened in that particular period of time. Another war seems to be one every 10 years, I think, every time I go back to the timeline. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the U.S. dollar, about the economy, the effect of the Great Depression on our future healthcare system or industry, if you want to call it that, and how that affected the Dust Bowl. Because a lot of things that happened in this period of time laid down the groundwork of some of the things we're plagued with today. So that's going to be the basis of this. I think we're going to talk a little bit about Kaiser today, which I'm excited to do.
Well, Kaiser has had a great role in American history, not just related to healthcare. We'll talk a little bit about that. And as we've said before, we're going to do a special show on Kaiser, on Henry J. Kaiser and Kaiser Industries and the Kaiser family. And we'll be joined by my good friend Henry M. Kaiser, the grandson of Henry J., and talk a little bit about it, not only a guy that set up what is one of the more interesting and successful healthcare systems we have today, but a guy that did a lot for America and had an interesting history in and of his own self, just beyond the healthcare things that he did.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to talk about. I've been doing a lot of research, and having covered Kaiser my entire career, I'm pretty excited to share some stories and some insight as to what we learned and I learned, and we've all learned that have Kaiser or have relatives that have Kaiser from the days that they were doing their turnaround to today, where they're quite the powerhouse, at least in Northern California and Southern California. And they're expanding into the Pacific Northwest as well.
Well, and Kaiser Industries and Kaiser Permanente, Kaiser Industries was the business side, was more of the hard business side of his equation, and Kaiser Permanente is the health side that kind of rose out of the things that he did. We'll talk a little bit about that today. They've had a national impact across the country. Kaiser Permanente, the health side, is not as strong in all 50 states, although it's got a pretty good presence across the United States. But Kaiser itself had an impact in many states, and including places like Hawaii and Cuba and others we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting too, because they're one of the few people that, one of the few organizations that the AMA went after, and they lost that battle. One of the few battles the AMA lost at that period of time.
Yeah.
So we'll talk more about the AMA and see what we go for there. In the last episode, again, we talked about the physician rises to power, the influence of the AMA, the establishment of the criteria for teaching institutions for medical schools. They basically locked it up at that point in time. We talked about the end of the medicine men, the patent medicine business, the rise of ethical pharmaceuticals, and we talked about the life and death of the last big patent medicine king, and that was the William H. Comstock and Company. So I think that pretty much wrapped it up on the patent medicine side. So today we're going to jump into the title of the episode, New Depression, New Deal, New War. So here we go with the first Great Depression. And from your book, The History and Evolution of Healthcare in America. And this is important as being a baby boomer, much like you, I was grounded by my parents and my grandparents and how difficult the Great Depression was. And that's all I heard about for quite some time. And I'm sure you had the same stories.
Oh, yeah.
Many a times I would just blow it off and say, oh, so what? But you really look into it, that generation had a tough time.
Well,
what happened in the turnaround?
Eat all that food, because I remember a time when we had food was rationed and we didn't have it. And, my mother used to eat lentil soup, and she ate it because it was the soup they ate in the Depression, and she forced us to eat lentil soup. I didn't personally like it all that much, but she made us eat lentil soup because it was to teach us the lesson of the Great Depression.
And we'll talk about the effect of World War II and how America rose to such predominance and the reasons why, which I think most people understand. Mm-hmm. But to quote your book, The History and Evolution of Healthcare in America, in the very beginning of this chapter, which is chapter 5 of the book, you had the following quote. Quote, "The issues that we have with our healthcare industry today continue to be sociological, political, economic, and medical science related. Many of the weeds that now plague our healthcare system got planted and laid down strong roots as a result of the decisions made to address the economic issues resulting from the Great Depression." End quote. Tom, can you please explain a little bit on this and how important this period is and how it requires some in-depth discussion and understanding?
Well, it's really important to understand what happened during this period, because it really did start to set the change in America. The founding fathers formed the country. They had the concept of a constitutional republic. They specifically created this concept of a constitutional republic, and they did so in order to put checks and balances in place to try and keep control over power and minimize the effect that power would have on the people that were governing the nation. But as we got into the period of the Great Depression, we ran into a series of hiccups in America. And some of those to us are hard today to understand, because our history, the history we understand about the Depression, is not always, or what happened before the Depression, is not always the truth. Now I'm going to talk about that in a second. But one of the things that started to come up in the 1930s into the 1940s was the concept of American exceptionalism. And it was driven by a goal to drive the idea that that America was an exceptional place, and it was done by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on purpose to start to prepare the U.S. for World War II, to enter World War II. We were isolationists. Most Americans didn't want to end up in the war, and Roosevelt realized if he didn't start to build a sense of purpose in America, that we were going to resist going to war, and the outcome of that war would have been bad for America. So he created an organization that still exists today called the NEA, and they literally rewrote our history books in order to build this perspective that we were not only the most prosperous nation on the planet, but also the idea that only America, only the American democracy could save the world from itself. Now, in and of themselves, these things are grand ideals and good ideals. But the problem is, like many of Roosevelt's ideas, that when World War II ended and America started to go forward into the 40s and 50s, these ideas didn't change. They were temporary, many of them in nature, and they didn't change. Another issue that came up in that period that's important for us to understand is what we'll call the cash and gold supplies that the U.S. had started to dry up. We had had many prior depressions and recessions in the history of our nation that again, we didn't learn about these things in our history books because we changed our history. Our government, because of this history of depressions and recessions, we always seemed to work our way out of it. As we started to come into the recession leading up to the crash of 29, the government didn't take very aggressive steps to fix anything in the early stages. They just kind of let it go. And you can look at the presidencies before Franklin Delano Roosevelt and go 2 presidents before, and including Herbert Hoover and Grover Cleveland, and you see that they had a laissez-faire attitude about a lot of things and did really nothing, figuring this thing would self-correct. And this really became part of the problem, was driven by World War I, I'll bring up in just a second. But the real history of America's economic success is not what we learned in school. We learned that we're a powerhouse nation that always have been. And America had a very, very hard economic past when you look at the period of 1792 all the way up till about World War II. So if you want to see the true history of the economy of the United States, you need to go to Google Books and look up a history book from 1872, 1875, and read American history then. You'll get a very different flavor for the nature of how strong our country was relative to our economy. Frankly, from the time we formed the country till World War II, we were skating on the edge of bankruptcy over and over and over again.
So it brings a question to me. American exceptionalism is not gone away. If you remember from the last election, it was up front and center. I heard it all the time.
Oh,
I heard it from Sean Hannity. I heard it from a whole. And the interesting thing is that Roosevelt was a Democrat.
Right.
That's the other interesting thing.
Well, but he was a Democrat, but he was one of the largest anti-socialist people of his day and era. So we think he brought forward the era of socialism in America and wanted us to have a grand society. But his view of the grand society is not the grand society view that we have today.
Exactly. So there's a lot of discussion in your book later on. We'll get into a later chapter about the dollar, because we're going to touch on the base on this again up until about 2010. But this particular issue with the cash reserves, the gold reserves, the value of the dollar must have had a large effect. What was happening to that dollar?
Well, it's the great question, frankly, of our age, because as we came out of, after founding of the United States, and let's assume for a minute a dollar was worth $1 after the founding of the United States, by the time we got to the War of 1812, it was worth about 62 cents. So our prosperity hadn't translated itself into a gain in our economic powerhouse, so to speak. And the reason was there was a world standard of gold. And at that time, it was gold and precious metals. It wasn't just gold. It was gold and silver and platinum and a few other metals. And we had, and the rest of the world was setting that standard because they controlled their banks. In fact, they controlled our banks. And if you look at what got us out of that problem, it was the War of 1812. In 1812, when we went back to war against England, we got ourselves off the gold standard, we exempted ourselves from it, and we were allowed to print more money. And in printing that money, we were able to inflate our economy and convince ourselves we had more money. And when the War of 1812 ended, no one forced us to go back on the gold standard. The problem was when we got out of World War I, again, we went off the gold standard. We inflated our currency. And when we got out of World War I, the British and the French and others forced us to go back on the gold standard. And they changed the valuation of the dollar back to what it was pre-war at the end of World War I. So the U.S. dollar at the end of World War I got reset to where $4.86 was then equal to one British pound. So even though we had seceded from Britain, the British banks and the French banks and the German banks, which, by the way, were the controlling banks of most of the banking institutions in the U.S. and also the people that were really what we call the Federal Reserve today, they reset our economy to kind of put America back in check and not let us get too big for our britches. So wars had been good for us, but by the time we get into the Depression, FDR has a problem. The dollar has been declining rapidly. He doesn't have much in gold to leverage. We didn't ever have much gold until World War II. And most importantly, he had the Federal Reserve, which is what we call the Federal Reserve today. They controlled our economy. They had control over what we were doing with money. The government of the United States in the Constitution does not have the power to print paper currency. This is something that's very interesting if you're not a scholar of the Constitution. Paper currency is created by a thing we now call the Federal Reserve. It was set up by Alexander Hamilton. And the Federal Reserve was an agreement he put in place with the banks at the founding of the United States that included French banks, German banks, English banks, and they became what we now call the Federal Reserve. And every 8 years, the charter of the Federal Reserve came back before Congress, and Congress reapproved the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve had power over our economy, but there was always this concept that we would get rid of them at some point. In fact, some presidents even created a federal currency called a greenback. The last person to do that, frankly, was Abraham Lincoln when the first Dust Bowl happened to help with that. But they had Roosevelt over a barrel. He needed money and he didn't have any. He knew the war was looming. So the Federal Reserve, therefore the banks, basically had him over a barrel. And they wanted certain concessions for them to cooperate with Roosevelt. They were not going to let him go off the gold standard again. So they had some concessions they wanted. Roosevelt had nowhere to go but to give in to them. And he did. He capitulated. And there were three main terms that he agreed to. One was the Federal Reserve no longer would be subject to an 8-year charter renewal. It would now be permanent and perpetual. The second thing was that they were no longer subject to any oversight and audit of their transactions. They would continue to be the private enterprise that they always had been. Remember, I said they're a private enterprise. People seem to think the Federal Reserve is a division of the U.S. government. It is not. It's a private corporation and has been since Alexander Hamilton got this thing set up. And no longer could the government audit their transactions, and that includes up to today. We cannot audit what the Federal Reserve does with money. And then finally, they had the unassailable and unilateral right to set whatever the interest rate and lending rates were going to be to the U.S. government. So those three things kind of set the stage in the Depression and what came afterwards to some of the issues we have economically today and why the economy of the United States and healthcare in the United States are so closely tied together.
I understand. So, good point. There's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. Now, the question I have is of these 3 points he capitulated on, I know the latter one is still in place. Are the other two still in place? Or did anything change?
No, nothing's changed. They're all still exactly the same. The Federal Reserve has a perpetual charter. Um, in fact, while we talk about the president or Congress approving the chairman of the Federal Reserve, when you really drill down into it and you look at the mechanics of it, they're ratifying the chairman of the Federal Reserve. They do have politically more influence today, but for many, many years, it wasn't up to the president or the Congress to determine who the chairman of the Federal Reserve was going to be.
So let's get this point clear. We have an individual or a board of individuals. We have a reserve chairman who's a non-elected official in charge of the biggest component of our economy that affects you and me every day. Am I that correct?
Yep, and there's almost nothing we can do about it, almost. And the reason is the federal government technically can't print currency because of the agreement we have with the Federal Reserve. And one other point about this, the government can do that, but the Federal Reserve can't print coins. The only person in the U.S. that can print coins is the federal government. That's the right they have in the Constitution, to mint coins. So if we wanted to get rid of paper currency and not fight a battle over greenback, we could go to printed metal coins again, and that would just make life wonderful.
And I got a whole deposit box full of silver dollars.
Yep.
Should keep those, right?
Yeah, I'd keep them. Silver's getting worth more than they were when you made the dollar.
Exactly. So from your book, these were not the only problems that drove us into the Great Depression. I remember that Herbert Hoover initiated what became the Smoot-Hawley Act. So I am not familiar with this act. Can you enlighten us a little bit here?
The Smoot-Hawley Act was an act that seriously hurt the economy of the United States, and there's a lot of topical relevance for it today. The Smoot-Hawley Act was a tariff act, and it was a series of tariffs that were put in place to tax incoming goods to the U.S. to protect the U.S. against unfair practices that were in those days being done primarily by England, France, and Germany. Oddly enough, the same places that controlled the banking industry in the United States. When you listen today, you're hearing a lot of talk from Republicans about they're not supporting Trump on his tariffs that he wants to apply to China and to the rest of the world. And if you just listen to the base of the argument, you would argue, oh, well, they didn't work then, they're a really bad idea. But tariffs are definitely not a solution. They're not a solution to our economy. And a trade war is not a solution to the economic disparity that one country has with another country. They're not designed to be that. They're no more a solution than a sword or a spear or a rifle or a gun or a grenade is in the fight for a political issue that's of the day, political disparity between nations. Those items, trade wars, tariffs, swords, spears, and guns, are weapons that get deployed to force a war of attrition that results in some form of a new agreement. They're put in place to force the change to a new agreement and a new relationship that takes away some of the disparity. And historically, hopefully, it was beneficial to the nation that implemented the trade war. Trump clearly is going after this, and I'm not defending him, but he's going after this concept of a trade war in order to set the stage to negotiate better deals with NAFTA, with China, with a number of other players. If he's successful at that, people are going to look back on this as a huge success. The problem with the Smoot-Hawley Act is that there was no strategy beyond applying the mechanical solution of increasing the cost coming into the country to force the purchase of more goods. And it really set up a further problem for the U.S. And remember, our dollar was not tied, our dollar was tied to gold and silver, and England and France and Germany controlled most of the gold and silver markets. So it didn't play well for us in the end. It was disastrous, and it really partly set the stage for the problem of the Depression.
And we'll see what happens now. If it's a long-term play that works, I'm fine with it, but the market doesn't like it. People that are investors don't like it. The traders love it. So we'll see what happens over the course of this next period of time. The
Yeah,
interesting thing is,
let me add one thing to that, Tim, that's important to know that we talk a lot about Wall Street and the stock market as if it is a harbinger of what's going on in the economy. They're really, throughout most of our history, those two things have been not that tightly linked. They're even less tightly linked now. And one of the mechanisms that the Federal Reserve today has that they didn't have 20 years ago was, since banks now control most investment banks because of another thing we're going to talk about in a minute, they can slap the president or they can slap Congress when they don't like a policy because it's bad for business. And they do so by taking the market down. And if they don't like Trump putting out tariffs, they take the market down. If they don't like the interest rate that the Federal Reserve does, the stock market will take it down. The stock market is often a switch, like your dad chasing you around the yard with a switch to slap your fanny when they don't like something you're doing. It may or may not be good for the country. It's just not good for their pocketbook.
that's clear. So we'll see what happens here. It's interesting that we say we don't have a trade war or tariff war because we didn't really apply them. There's a committee, all sorts of people. We haven't figured out what to do. Well, China, they slapped theirs on, and they don't have any committee. They just did it. Yep. So, a little bit different set of rules, I think. So
yeah, the one thing about China is China could have slapped on a much worse set of sanctions than they did. If you look at what they've attached them to, it's a political move. It's not an economic move. They're trying to slap the support base that Trump had during the election and hit the areas most affecting him. In the long run, I think we're going to see this isn't going to be a long battle. I think we'll get to a new deal with China and others soon. At least I hope we will.
Yeah, I agree. So to me, one of the other more fascinating lost bits of history is the Dust Bowl era. I didn't really study it that much when I was in school. I think I remember reading The Grapes of Wrath, I believe, and the modern controversy as to whether or not it is the cause of the Depression. So is this a cause and effect, or what's your take on this?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the history that you and I got, we didn't get a whole lot about what happened leading up to the Depression because, frankly, it wouldn't have been part of American exceptionalism to be bringing up some of the dirty laundry. We didn't get a big education in that. And
Correct.
As a result of it, today, most historians blame the Depression simply on the stock market crash in 1929. But more and more modern economists are starting to see that it's a symptom of the economic disease. It's not the cause of the disease. And the real true cause of the problem was what we'll call the Dust Bowl era. It was the root cause of the Depression. What happened during the Dust Bowl was the culmination, the worst, of a series of droughts and windstorms that had started happening before Lincoln got elected that caused crop failures. And then with the crop failures became lack of rain, which created drier conditions. The topsoil in the Midwest was not very deep. And as a result, what happened is the fertile topsoil, when the windstorms came, it literally blew much of the fertile topsoil from the Midwest of the United States, our national breadbasket. It blew it to the East Coast. And this sounds almost unbelievable, but it's true. And it left the breadbasket barren, and it left the farmers in disarray. It left the Midwest in a massive crisis, economic crisis. It caused a worse problem. And it was the Dust Bowl that really played, I think, the prominent role in this period and was really the direct catalyst for what became the start of not only the Great Depression, but it also created the start of some of the things that happened in healthcare because we had so many people that literally had lost everything. And sanitation was failing, things were getting problematic, and we were starting to have lots and lots of disease happening across the country. And a lot of it was happening in the Midwest at this point in time.
Interesting facts. I remember growing up in Illinois, we had some of the most fertile land. Corn was the primary crop.
Right.
And when I grew up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, the rich people there were the farmers. They weren't anybody else. So that's all changed over time, I think. I haven't been there in a long time. So what else did FDR do to help get us out of depression? We've all heard the New Deal. Why don't you give us a 30,000 viewpoint of what all that stuff was about?
Well, when Roosevelt came in, he had a lot of problems. And as we said, he had people that were not really standing up for America, and particularly not standing up for the war, that knew that we needed to go, and they were holding him hostage. So Roosevelt fought back. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he created what we now call the New Deal. As the recession started to worsen, Wall Street exacerbated the problems of the recession, and the crash contributed heavily to the problems in the U.S. because there was rampant speculation going on, and there was very close ties between investment banks and the banks themselves. In fact, many of the banks of the day were also the investment banks that were controlling Wall Street. And they were doing all kinds of speculation, kind of like what happened in 2009 when they were doing mortgage-backed derivatives and all these other things that really led to the collapse in 2009. But in order to address the devastation that the Depression had on the country then, and also to prepare the nation for war, which FDR knew was coming, he proposed a number of new initiatives and laws that restructured the economy and helped get our nation back on its feet. So here's a few. He established regulations to fight deflationary, cutthroat competition through a thing called the NRA. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's not National Rifle Association, although that would have been a solution, I think. He set laws that allowed for the setting of minimum prices and wages and labor standards and competitive conditions in all industries, again by the NRA. He encouraged unionization, but excluded public employees as a method by which it could raise wages in order to increase the power of working people. And by the way, every one of these things Roosevelt saw as temporary. They were not in his mind to be permanent. He forced businesses to work with the government to set price codes through this NRA. He cut farm production and forced a rise in food prices through what he called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So he put these things in places in a way for him to control wage, control price, control output, and control production. So he could start to manage through a supply and demand kind of an approach.
So from my experience on Capitol Hill, and also being involved in a number of different discussions around some of these actions and some of the things we have today, there's nothing temporary about anything that passes in Congress. Once it's there, it continues to stay for a very long time.
That's right.
And I suspect this is what happened here as well.
Well, it's not even a suspicion. It's true. I mean, you get to 1948 and 1949, many of the things that got passed, Social Security and other things like that, were supposed to go out and be replaced with private systems. The Congress that Roosevelt had taken from a part-time citizen politician and made in effect a full-time political Congress was supposed to go out in 1949 and revert back to the 4 months on, 6 months off cycle that was in place before he got in as president. But as we all know, Congress made themselves permanent. Their salaries became permanent and began to get a perpetual escalation. And we ended up with a professional political class and a number of very expensive social programs at the time they were devised as a temporary solution to a problem.
And it became the ever permanent pay me to talk to me program that we have today with our lobbyists. And I can't talk to a congressperson without handing the bad guy a $300 check.
Pretty much, or more.
Yeah.
Or significantly
much
more.
more. So I mean, I'm on the cheap side. I'd get to 5 minutes, but this is ridiculous. I'm all for a government shutdown. I think you should go home and don't come back because they're not getting anything done now anyway. But that's just my 2 cents.
I think one of the things that happened in the last election, the guy from Texas whose name I can't think of, I think he's at the Energy Department now. In his debate, he made one comment that one of the things he said is he wanted to take Congress back to part-time, and I literally jumped out of the chair and said, "Hallelujah!"
Yeah. Well, look, when you've got somebody like Grassley that's been there for how many years? He's been there forever. We got people that was the guy that was exposing himself. He's been in Congress. He finally got on. Come on, really? It's mind-boggling to me. It really is.
It is an interesting collection. It's an interesting collection of audio animatronic dolls, if you ask me.
Yeah.
Walt Disney would be proud if he went there today.
Yeah. I think Barnum Bailey would be too. So FDR also began to restructure the economy, correct?
Yes, he did. And most importantly, FDR moved to make the required changes in our economic structure that existed before. We are all aware of the Securities Act of 1933. Anybody who's in business has heard of the Securities Act of 1933. There's a lot of rules in it we live by. It comprehensively regulated the securities industry. It went in and set real limits to what the people that buy and sell stock could do, how they could sell them, what the requirements were for them to push an issue forward for sale. That was followed immediately the following year by the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, and that created the Securities and Exchange Commission, the people with the oversight to police what happens in stock transfers in the United States. And they have had a very good history of policing what goes on in public offerings and the sale of both private stock and public stock, what's called exempt securities and non-exempt securities. The Federal Insurance the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created to insure bank deposits and make sure that a certain minimum number of money that people put away, $250,000, would be insured by the government so they wouldn't end up with people that happened in the Depression, elderly people who literally had worked their entire lives to save for retirement and had their retirement go up in smoke. In fact, that was the reason Roosevelt created the Social Security Act in the first place and made it temporary. He needed a way to bridge these people that had worked their whole lives and had no time left to work to make it up, give them a buffer so that when the economy collapsed, they could survive long enough. The idea was then it would tail off and we would get back to normalcy. Of course, it didn't tail off. And then the last and most important thing was the Glass-Steagall Act, which almost everybody today has probably heard of because of the 2009 financial crisis. And the Glass-Steagall Act was a series of laws that prohibited banks from having any relationship with investment banks. They had to sell off their investment bank or become two companies or whatever, but there had to be a clear dividing wall between an investment bank and a bank. The two could not work together on anything, and that existed for quite a while.
So I remember this very well because I was on the flight to Boston the day all the wheels came off on this thing. So Glass-Steagall, Tom Sullivan, who I listen to all the time, I think is one of the best talk radio hosts in the country. He equates this exact same thing we're about to discuss to the collapse of 2009. Isn't that when Bill Clinton eliminated and caused our own generation's collapse at that period?
Bill Clinton did, in fact, eliminate the Glass-Steagall Act and tore down the wall that existed between the banks and investment banks. It is one of a series of steps. It is not the only step. There is a long series of steps starting all the way back in 1940 that bring us to the point of where we were in 2009. There was the elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act. There was a change in accounting laws that changed what the value of a mortgage portfolio was to what was called mark-to-market instead of a net future value. It seriously reduced the asset value of mortgages that particularly savings and loans had, and it forced the savings and loan crisis and a lot of things that came afterwards. The elimination of Glass-Steagall was created a few years before by the things I just mentioned, and it became, quote unquote, the thing we had to do to fix the problem. it was not the fix to the problem. The problem was the argument on why they needed to finally get rid of Glass-Steagall, which they didn't want in the first place. And we kind of went along for the ride, and we exist there today. Roosevelt also established this NRA, which stood for National Recovery Act, and that brought about a series of wage and price controls. And today, the NRA is one of the most controversial things that FDR did, and primarily it is because the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional and threw it out. So, we had a number of things that grew out of the NRA, some of which kind of stayed around and were exempted and kept going. The WPA, where you have lots of projects in the U.S. to build infrastructure. But the NRA was thrown out. There was some really bad things that happened with the NRA. Maybe we'll do a story about one of them having to do with a person growing grain who ended up going to jail because he grew more grain than he was legally allowed to do under the Agriculture Act, and he used it himself, and he was deemed as destroying the market for grain, and he ended up going to jail. Eventually that was thrown out. But the thing that allowed Roosevelt to move forward with this was using the idea of the Commerce Clause to expand the power of the federal government, which we heard a lot about over the past 10 years. But it was the first extension of the Commerce Clause to get the government's nose under the tent on how they could actually take power away from the states was the patent medicine men and the things they did with the Patent and Trademark Act that they put in place. That became the precedent for weakening the Commerce Clause and allowing the government to get into doing all these things that before was not the province of the federal government, it was the province of the state government. So those things had significant impact on where we are today.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happened back then that we see perpetuated today and what has been, again, the roots of some of our problems. So, up until this period of time, I think most people paid for their own insurance out of their own pockets, correct?
Yeah. There was a little bit of insurance happening, and there was a variety of things going on around 1930, 1935. In that period of time, there was some early forms of more aligned with what Kaiser started to do. There had been attempts at health insurance before, but they really were just life insurance policies that were going to kick in if you ended up catastrophically ill, which was where the indemnity policy started to come from later. But there was no organized insurance programs at that point.
So then comes along the American Hospital Association in 1932, warning that the U.S. hospital system was on the verge of a breakdown. So out of the bowels of the Great Depression, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as we know the names today, a not-for-profit insurer that offered hospital coverage was born. The AMA gave Blue Shield a blessing, in part because Blue Shield agreed to pay any qualified provider that the patient chose.
Right.
In other words, the insurer made no attempt to use its purchasing power to extract discounts by setting up a closed network of doctors, as we see today.
Right.
All over the place, whether you're a PPO or whether you're an HMO or however you want to call it, or what they call a managed competition, which we'll get into. Nor the doctors would be required to charge all the patients the same fee. Yeah, we've just been talking about that this morning, right, in your current situation. So
exactly.
Under Blue Shield, they can continue, billing their patients for the difference between what they chose to charge versus what's reimbursed. But there's one more piece I want to bring up because it plagued us until probably into the late 60s. I may be somewhat off on that. I'll look into it when we get onto the next chapters. But Blue Cross helped pave the way for healthcare inflation. This is very important.
Yep.
By reimbursing hospitals on the basis of their cost.
Right.
This was a perverse example. This was a bad incentive because it would fuel the healthcare spending for the rest of the century.
Right.
In the hospitals that were more efficient and managed to reduce the cost of doing business, they would find their income reduced significantly for years to come. Thus, hospitals were encouraged to solve financial problems, not by minimizing costs and becoming efficient, but by maximizing their costs. That's how they were getting paid. And
Right.
this is why you saw MRI on every corner. You saw duplication of services within all these hospitals that were right next door to each other. And they could not do anything wrong because they know their cost would be reimbursed. This is a very important piece to understand because it drove a tremendous amount of spending and inflation in the healthcare industry. Your thoughts on that one?
Well, it's true, and it did, and it didn't happen all at once. It happened in a series of steps and counter steps as Blue Cross was paying physicians. And again, this is in the days initially of indemnity insurance, not in the HMOs, where all they covered was catastrophic illness. You didn't get paid for doctor's visits. You didn't get paid for a lot of this stuff. You didn't get reimbursed for it. The patient paid for those things. But as we start moving forward, there became this push-pull between the doctor and the insurance company. And the patient became less and less part of the game as time goes on. So the real negotiations were going on between doctors and hospitals and insurers. And when it started as being a way of paying for cost, at the beginning, it didn't make much difference because if I'm a doctor and I treat you for appendicitis and the hospital charges, most of the time everything came down to the cost was whatever I needed to get paid to do the service. It wasn't this idea of a doctor and a hospital having margin, whether they were profit or non-profit, wasn't the core issue. We developed this idea that somehow non-profits were always going to be cheaper because there wasn't profit. That's not always the case. But as it grew and grew, then it moved from that to negotiating a discount from your price, because I can no longer believe your price anymore. Because what happened is doctors and hospitals realized, well, if they're going to charge me, I got to increase my price, my cost. I have to increase my cost or else I don't get enough money to pay everything below it. So costs started to rise in order to offset the additional pressure that Blue Cross and Blue Shield was placing on what they were going to be willing to pay for these services. And that led into HMOs, which took that up massively. And we ended up with a situation where instead of me charging $1 and getting paid $1, by the time you get into the 70s, I'm charging you $1 and you're paying me 25 to 28 cents. And as I've said today, we're paying somewhere between 18 and 22 cents for the same thing. And it was Blue Cross and Blue Shield and these things that started to lay the groundwork for where we are now.
Yeah, at the same time, I understand that the IRS kind of blessed this whole program by allowing employers to deduct the cost of that benefit from the corporate income tax.
And again, no one sat down and figured this out. No one sat there and said, "Oh, we can defraud the public if we do this." It's just a lot of people started making a lot of decisions that seemed right at the time, were all fairly short term, and no one ever really thought too far in how this was going to impact the overall system of healthcare. Why? Because we don't have and didn't have a healthcare system. No one ever sat down and decided how this thing was going to work in the first place. It's one of the fundamental myths about fixing our healthcare system is that we actually have a system to start with.
Yes, it's pretty hard to, again, it's not a system. If it's a system, this is what we learned in total quality management. You measure things coming in, going out, you look for the deficiencies, then you go back and change the process, right?
Yeah, and well, in
this whole system,
in the healthcare system, we manage things that are already in the system. We manage how they're moving around the various pieces inside the system, and we pray to God they never come in or go out of the system because we have no idea how we're going to deal with that.
And there's like no systematic process,
right,
to understand what all the information means and how to correlate it together.
Exactly.
It doesn't exist.
It's not in it. It doesn't exist. And it can. It's something that you and I will be proposing after the next few episodes and start to talk about how we can do it. It can exist very well, and it makes a lot of sense. It's simple, it's effective, and it's easy to do as long as we change our mindset. But it can be done.
So to everyone listening, electronic medical records is not the solution. It's we're data rich and knowledge poor, and it's not done anything specifically to solve this problem.
Well, it's done one thing, and there's a second study just came out. We talked about one a couple of weeks ago. A second study has just come out, and electronic health records are actually making healthcare more dangerous, which you and I predicted 5 to 8 years ago. I can't remember the date you and I talked about it, but a while ago.
Let's get on and let's close this out today because we're getting over about an hour now. Let's talk about high level of Henry J. Kaiser's health solution. I think it's a good segue, and then we'll get into World War II and pick this back up if that's okay with you, because I think we'll probably take over the rest of the next 10, 15 minutes on Kaiser.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So Henry Kaiser is an amazing man, and I knew something about him before I did the healthcare book. I had met his grandson in business and got to know him. We became pretty good friends. It's very likely that my grandfather on my mother's side and Henry J. Kaiser of Kaiser Industries knew each other because they were both involved in the automobile business fighting Henry Ford back in the 20s. And were part of the same group, so they may have known each other. But the interesting thing is Henry Kaiser was born in 1882 in Springbrook, New York. He started life as an apprentice photographer, and by the age of 20, he was running the company that he started apprenticing for. He took his initial earnings and moved to Washington State and started to get involved in road buildings. There was a program called Good Roads. As cars started to hit the marketplace, there was this Good Roads movement, and the federal government was paying to have paved roads put throughout the United States. In all the counties, in all the little cities, they were going to start paving roads. And Henry Kaiser saw money and saw there was a way to get into this business, and he bought some of the first powered equipment for road paving and graders and steamrollers back when they ran on steam, and set up a company in 1914 to do road paving up in Seattle, Washington. By 1927, he had received a contract of $20 million to build roads through the country of Cuba. And he went to Cuba. Yeah, $20 million.
Yeah, go on, because I want to jump in here for a minute.
Yeah.
I'm really glad he did that. You know why? Because it's on my bucket list to get to Cuba and see those old cars, which probably are in pretty good shape because he built those roads before Cuba's not what it is today. So my bucket list is to go to Cuba, and I'm so glad he built those roads.
Well, if you go to Hawaii, you'll see, interestingly enough, there's Kaiser things all around Hawaii on all the islands. You'll see Kaiser schools, Kaiser this, all named after Henry J. Kaiser. It's not because of Kaiser Permanente, which also is in Hawaii. It's because Henry Kaiser got the contract to build all the roads in Hawaii. And Kaiser Industries built all those roads. And he had built a good business. He was obviously making money. It was becoming very successful. And he and 5 other companies came together. It was called the 6 Companies. And they got a contract to build the Hoover Dam, which was then one of the largest projects in the world. It has been estimated that building the Hoover Dam was larger than any of the projects ever done in Egypt. It was just a massive undertaking. Between 10,000 and 20,000 people migrated to Las Vegas, Nevada, by the way, from the Midwest, looking for jobs. Many didn't get jobs. But they hung around waiting for opportunities to get jobs because not everybody lasted there. Many people got sick. A number of people died. 121 people died related to working on the dam. And there were untold numbers of people, family members, who died in these camps that they had. There were 2 main camps near the Hoover Dam. One was called Williamsville, also known as Ragtown. Another was called McKeeversville. And these were camps that were squalid camps of migrants that had fled the Depression in the Midwest, brought their families here to try and find work in some way to survive. And the biggest project in the U.S. was the Hoover Dam, and they all came there. like I say, 10 to 20,000 people. There was no infrastructure to take care of them. So as I said, there was 112 people died working on the dam, and they didn't count the people that were families because they weren't work-related deaths. There was no clean water. There was no sanitation. There was no way to keep food from spoiling, so most of the food was spoiled before it was delivered. There was dysentery. There was carbon monoxide poisoning. There was pneumonia. There was a serious number of horrible infections, skin infections, all kinds of bladder infections, other things. There was no access to any pediatric or obstetrics care, and they were bringing families with no real forms of birth control, and lots of babies were being born. As a result of it, Henry Kaiser, one of the guys in the 6 companies, took a tour of McKeeversville and was horrified, absolutely horrified of the desolation that he saw in the camps around the Hoover construction project. And he set out to try and find a way to solve the healthcare problem. Now, he wasn't able to get it put in place because it wasn't Henry Kaiser, it was 6 companies, and most of the companies didn't want to be involved in worrying about this. They just wanted to complete the dam. So, but it made a big impact on him. The next thing that came up during this period of time was, oddly enough, there was this thing called the LA Aqueduct, which was going on in the early 30s, and they were building the water system to deliver water to LA. This plays a pivotal role in America's healthcare and Kaiser's history because there was a guy named Dr. Garfield who was the basic physician that was treating most of the people working on the LA Aqueduct. And there was a guy named Harold Hatch who was an insurance agent who was trying to sell insurance to people for healthcare. Well, the problem for Dr. Garfield and the problem for Harold Hatch was not many people were willing to buy insurance policies because the cost per claim and the death cost to the insurance companies was so high, the average person couldn't afford it. But he started working with Dr. Garfield, and they came to an agreement that they would collect so much money per worker per week from the builder of the aqueduct and pay it to Dr. Garfield, kind of like a salary, and Garfield would agree to take care of that worker for whatever happened work-related. And then they decided after they did that, if they charged $5, and that was like $5 a week. If they charged $5 more, Dr. Garfield said he would take care of the family and the workers for anything that happened. And that is the beginning of kind of the thing that we talk a lot about today, and it began on the LA Aqueduct. Well, Henry Kaiser found out about it, and he had then gotten a contract to build the Grand Coulee Dam, not quite as big as the Hoover Dam, but it's still a big project. And he didn't want to go into this thing and have the same problem. As I said, he was horrified by the conditions of these people and heartsick with the damage that was done to families and people and humanity as a result of this project. So the LA Aqueduct was finishing, and Kaiser met with Garfield and hired Garfield to come in to provide health care to the workers of the Grand Coulee Dam and their families. He bought a rundown hospital up in Washington State. He gave it to Garfield, who then refit this hospital and focused it on servicing the needs of the people building the dam and their families. And that was the forerunner of what we now call Kaiser Permanente. And of course, when the war happened, and he set up Kaiser Industries and Kaiser Shipbuilding, that'll be the next phase of the story. But this became the nucleus of an idea that he then used to solve a problem when he started building Liberty ships and creating steel for the U.S. in World War II. And it became the germ that became what's Kaiser Industries today.
Yes, and the story is incredible. We're going to have a whole series on this. This was a concept that was not well supported by many people at the time. And so having to go through the tribulations he went through to pull this off is an interesting story. I have personally been involved with Kaiser since I moved to Northern California in 1988. I've done millions and millions of dollars of transactions with them, both from the medical technology sales side as well as medical services. So I know this group very, very well. It's really a number of groups, as you mentioned before. You have the professional component, which is a foundation, and then you have the operational side of the business, which is Kaiser Permanente. So the structure we'll talk about when we start talking a little bit more about Kaiser, because California is a corporate practice medicine state, which means unless you enter a foundation model that has strict rules and regulations, you as a corporation can't hire doctors directly. So we'll talk a lot about that in a future episode and what that means. So today they are the largest managed care organization in the United States. California is the biggest market. Hawaii, Washington, they just moved into with the purchase of Group Health. Oregon, Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, and the District of Columbia. They do have operations in Denver, but they're more on the outpatient side. So they have over 12 million lives under contract. When we talk about lives, that's individuals. That's the way it's talked about in the medical industry. That's a big number. And so that's how they kind of leverage their organization. They run a great economies of scale program, in my opinion. They have over 210,000 employees today. And that doesn't include the physicians, which we'll talk about under the KFHP model. Around 22,000 physicians, probably a little more than now. $65 billion in operating revenue as of 2016, and a $3.2 billion net income. So again, their model is different. I'm going to separate the Medicare patients for a minute. If you're not a Medicare patient, in most cases, you're going to pay them a flat fee, or your employer is going to offer you a Kaiser plan where they get paid a flat fee. Kaiser gets paid a flat fee to cover your life. And that means they cover everything within that life minus your deductibles. And the programs change, and we'll probably have Val on here to explain those to us at some point, because there's very, very different models within the scheme of what they offer in the way of packages to individuals and employers. And Medicare is also a little bit different too, because that's handled a little bit differently. And I found out just recently from my mother-in-law's experience there, so I can talk to that. So Tom, I know you've spent some time on one or two of Kaiser's corporate jets, and you're also very familiar with Kaiser. They keep them parked out there at that Oakland airport, I think, maybe at Concord now. Can you help us understand the Kaiser model a little bit better, and that I've explained, and what their managed care model actually looks like?
Well, it's morphed over the years. It's evolved over the years. Kaiser is the most effective form of industrialized medicine that there is. As you know, during the Affordable Care Act, there were a lot of people pushing for a single payer model, and they were referencing Kaiser as an example of it.
Yes.
Kaiser is probably the best example of why there is no such thing as a single payer, because not every service you need is provided by Kaiser. In fact, Kaiser is a very, very good example of what we'll call a life care company, a life care healthcare company should look like. It's a company that provides the things people need and does so fairly cost effectively and very efficiently. But it has a series of things in how it provides this care that is different than what many Americans want in healthcare. Not what they need in healthcare, what they want. So Kaiser is a wonderful system, and people that are in it, many people are in it, that think Kaiser is one of the best healthcare systems they can be part of. And there are many people that are in Kaiser that don't like a lot about it. And Kaiser has built a fairly effective system at dealing with the things people need. But Kaiser is not a very effective system at delivering the things to patients that patients want. In fact, for Kaiser, delivering those wants to patients is very expensive and actually breaks their system. And one of the issues that Kaiser has had throughout its life is, in effect, restricting by packaging the care that you get for the price. And at the very beginning, you basically paid them $5, and if my kid was sick, I took him in and they treated him. And that was fine. But I didn't get to go in and say, oh, by the way, I saw this ad on TV and I want to use Xarelto instead of warfarin because I hear Xarelto is so much better, and I thought the girl in the ad was just super cool looking, and I really want to get that drug. The people at Kaiser are basically going to say, no. And I'm not saying that none of the physicians are going to prescribe you Xarelto, but by and large, Kaiser sets up protocols of what they're willing to do for you when you come in the door, and they stick to it. You don't get to see the same physician anytime you go. You get kind of what Kaiser brings to you. Yeah.
Yes, I want to make one point here. The argument had been early on to the exact thing that you just discussed, is that Kaiser is the fox guarding the hen house. And you see more and more insurance carriers now, or insurance companies, or what we call payers, buying up healthcare providers. It's happening a lot lately.
Yep.
So Kaiser had the first model of that. So intuitively, people would think, well, gee whiz, if you're paying me $100 to take care of you, what's my incentive to take care of you? Because I can make $100 and I don't have to put the money into taking care of you. I'm going to give you the minimum.
Exactly.
There was a lot of arguments about that. But when
it's
you go back and receive,
it's the old adage. It's the old adage that it's the least I can do for you, and that's what I want to do the very least.
Yeah, but that argument doesn't pan out,
right?
Because when you go back and you look at the data, and the data is very compelling, Kaiser ranks right up there with some of the highest medical institutions in the country.
They do.
Their quality measurements are off the charts in many cases. What Kaiser does effectively, and I've seen it firsthand, and it's gotten so much better in the last 10, 15, 20 years, they don't duplicate services in markets that they have a large footprint in. Let me give you an example. In Northern California, you have a heart problem, you're going to go, I don't know which hospital it is, it could be Kaiser Oakland, could be another one, I'm not sure which one it is. If you have a neuro problem, you're going to go to Kaiser Walnut Creek or whatever that is, right? Because that's where they have this, they scale themselves. Right. Where other hospital systems have to repeat the same services to compete with the other hospitals in the area to develop and perpetuate this predatory type of hostile economic environment. Right. Kaiser's insulated from that because patients may not like having to drive to Oakland to get, a heart exam or something like that. But that's the way it is. Yep. And that's the way they control many of their programs.
Yep. And very, very little in Kaiser goes outside of their quote unquote network. And when it does go out of the network, it is typically very divorced from what's happening in Kaiser. They do have effective patient information system in Kaiser. They have had for a number of years. They, for years and years, were a closed shop. In fact, when I was working in one of my prior companies managing HIV and AIDS patients, at one point we were the only other company that Kaiser had allowed to be able to tie directly into their patient record system so we could share records on HIV and AIDS patients and do it efficiently. But they're very, very good. They're very efficient. They do provide very good care. I think, and they used to have one of the lower mortality and morbidity rates. I'd have to check to see if that's still the case. But they are not a place to go for frills. That's one of the reasons that I've said that we have on one hand a life care market and another hand a quality of life market. And in the discussions with Henry Kaiser, my friend Henry Kaiser, one of the issues we keep coming back to is the role Kaiser plays. And unlike a lot of healthcare reform things that have not been good for Kaiser, the system we're talking about actually is good for Kaiser because it plays to their strength and it doesn't force them to change much about how they do what they do.
Exactly. But another point from Maggie Meyer's book, Money Driven Medicine, makes a very good point. Doctors in general, I'm not talking about Kaiser doctors, physicians in general aren't paid to talk a long time with you. They're paid to do things. And what we see, and I see it, we talked about this before, the pressure on them from MACRA and all these other things that are coming down and their charting and everything causes them to act the way they act because that's how they get paid.
Right.
Kaiser physicians are salaried. Now, real life experience with my mother-in-law just recently. She had fallen and she banged up her knee pretty bad. So I made arrangements to take her to the, I think it was called the wound care or whatever. It was the most efficient thing I've ever seen. I get her into Walnut Creek. We walk right in. The doctor's waiting for us. You know how long that doctor spent? 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
45 minutes. But you know what he did? He had the nurse take care of the scrape and the cut. He talked to her.
Mm-hmm.
He asked her things that no one else asked. What's going on? What can I do to help? I can tell you, I had not seen that in any of the physicians that I've gone to for a long time, except one, Javed, you know him really well.
Right.
But to me, the level of detail, and I told my wife when we left, I said, I have a whole new perspective from what we've experienced here in those last 2 episodes with this. So, and they also give their physicians flexibility. They hire a lot of physicians that are married to each other.
Mm-hmm.
They give them flexible time with their children. They give them flexible work hours. What physicians don't like today, at least the ones I talk to, is they have to spend all this time charting. They have to spend all this back office stuff. They have to go back and fight the constant denials through benefit management companies, which aren't anything benefit about them. And then they have to fight for their patients, and they have to do all this paperwork. And when you go to a Kaiser organization, that's all gone.
Yep.
You don't have that overhead.
Oh, yeah.
And the physicians I talk to there, they love that. So they've done something right. The physicians, from my point of view, that I've dealt with, are pretty happy.
Mm-hmm.
And I know many of them personally, and they're doggone good doctors.
Right.
So I'm not a commercial for Kaiser. I'm just saying, I've seen a growth within that organization that's been very pleased to watch them develop over the period of time that I've been in California.
Well, they're an impressive organization. They're like I say, they are the best of the industrial form of healthcare that I think exists. I don't know this to be a fact, but I am pretty sure, and when we do the special on Kaiser, we'll talk a little bit about this. As I said, Henry J. and my grandfather, George Wigington, shared some common occurrences in the automobile industry. They shared a common disaffection with Henry Ford. And Henry Ford pissed off a lot of people because he vertically integrated his process. And in the process, he tried to drive a lot of people out of business. Like a part of Kaiser Industries, it was making components, part of one of my grandfather's companies that was providing services to Ford. But the lessons of vertical integration was something that Henry J. Kaiser built into what he did in steel, in manufacturing of Liberty ships, and really, as Kaiser Permanente moved from what they did in the Grand Coulee Dam to the provision of health care to workers in his factories during World War II, it was a vertical integration model that he felt was really lowering the cost for his people. So Kaiser is an industrial form of healthcare in every sense of the word, even into the idea of vertical integration. It's an interesting piece of the history, and we're going to do a special episode on Kaiser because there is many more things to the Kaiser story that are fascinating. And when we get Henry on here, he's going to tell you some of the Kaiser family story that is another characteristic story of America. It impacts healthcare, it impacts other things, but it's really is. This is one of the most interesting parts of history when it comes to healthcare, is this period of time.
Yeah, so it's some pretty interesting background and backstory on this we'll get into. So actually World War II, we'll be getting into that. And that's going to be an interesting discussion because I have some kind of thoughts around FDR in that one too. Some controversial thoughts that I have around that. We'll see how that pans out in our discussion. We'll talk about the push for a national healthcare insurance This is the Obamacare and the Bill Clinton stuff. They weren't the guys that thought this stuff up. This has been going on for quite some time. So we'll talk about FDR. We'll be talking in the next episode about Nixon. There's a lot of folks that have tried to push for this, quote, single payer system, which we'll never have. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the Blue Cross and some of the insurance programs that were put together and kind of still with us today. That'll take us through this period of time and up to 1950. So episode 1.7 will close out chapters 5. We'll get into 1950 and 1980 after that. This is going to be the one I've been waiting for. I've put a lot of effort into this one, and we both are going to relate to this particular period, I think, very well. So thank you again for your time and the great stories and great education. I hope you're healing up and doing well, and I look forward to doing it again probably in the next few days.
Yep, well, me too. And again, thanks to the audience for listening to us. This one is going to be a little longer. Typically, we've been coming in under an hour. There was a lot of meat here that I think is very important. So this one's going to come in probably an hour and 15, hour, 20 minutes. So we apologize for going a little longer, but this is really, the next 3 episodes are really the core of what we need to understand about healthcare. So as we start to talk about the ideas on how we can get effective healthcare in America, there's a basic level of relevance there to how we got here and why some of the things we've tried to do has not worked. And it will help show how we can build a fairly elegant and simple solution that solves these equations. So thanks for coming along for the ride. Tell your friends to come listen to the series and subscribe, and remember to press the like button. And we'll see you again pretty soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.